Ivy Hill basked gently beneath a beautiful June sky, its cottages adorned with climbing roses and honeysuckle in blossom. The air hummed gently with polite laughter, clinking teacups, and whispered talk as people came for the annual church fete, which was typically held in the lawn of the beautiful Ivy Manor. It was an event as familiar and comfortable as the village bells ringing every Sunday morning. Miss Jane Marple, comfortably situated beneath the generous shade of an ancient oak, studied the scene with mild curiosity and careful attention, her fingers busy with a knitting project, the needles clicking regularly as her delicate gaze scanned faces, conversations, and subtle gestures. Miss Florence Aonathi, her plump figure covered in flowered muslin, flushed with heat or excitement, commented, "Lovely day, isn't it, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple wasn't sure which was lighter, she said softly, seeing Florence's teacup trembling slightly in her grasp. Of course, weddings always cause a commotion, Mrs. Abanath continued, leaning in Everyone is talking about the young couple. Emma Fairchild marries Richard Hartwell. Such a good match. Miss Marple gave a slight smile. Indeed, weddings bring out the best and sometimes the worst in people, don't you find? Florence blinked, little disconcerted. I hope not, but young love, she sighed tenderly. Isn't it quite uplifting? Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Emma Fairchild, who wore a cream dress with ivory roses tastefully placed in her black curls. Richard Hartwell, handsome and reserved, stood protectively beside her, his eyes narrowing occasionally as guests approached, offering congratulations that were perhaps too effusive or too familiar. A shadow briefly darkened Miss Marple's countenance as she studied another figure, a petite woman whose beautiful stance seemed at odds with her frequent looks toward Richard. Richard's childhood friend, Evelyn Summers, appeared calm, but her fingers clenched frantically around a dainty silver spoon she clutched securely, one particularly engraved for the bridal tea. I dare say there are undercurrents, Miss Marple remarked carefully, more to herself than her friend. Florence Abnethy followed Miss Marple's gaze and smiled knowingly. What are your thoughts on jealousy? Evelyn has always had a strong preference for the wealthy. Fondness may be tricky, Miss Marple answered gently, brows narrowing slightly as she observed Evelyn's quick jump at Richard's warm chuckle. The garden buzzed with talk, disturbed only by a wave of stress that no one else noticed. Miss Marple took note of everything, including the subtle glance exchanged between Richard's father, Major Hartwell, and a younger woman, Rose Bellamy, who quickly turned away when their eyes met. The meticulous way Emma's mother, Judith Fairchild, continuously smoothed the tablecloth with nervous fingers. The chatting and giggling of two housemaids from Ivy Manor, who appeared abnormally eager to slip away from their chores. Is something bothering you, Miss Marple? Reverend Caldwell approached slowly, his eyebrows furrowed with anxiety. You look rather grave, merely observing, Reverend. Miss Marple said softly, even in the most serene of settings, human nature brings unending curiosity. The Reverend chuckled slightly. I suppose that's why you're such a good judge of character. But let us hope that today stays a pleasant occasion. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused briefly. One always hopes that as tea was served, sunshine glinted off silver spoons bearing the bride and groom's initials. Judith Fairchild made a wonderful gesture to mark the day. Guests applauded them, mumbling praise. Evelyn Summers, however, paused slightly before laying hers down suddenly on the linen-covered table. A problem, Miss Summers? Miss Marple asked gently, her tone intentionally neutral. Oh no, not at all, Evelyn answered swiftly, her fingers undoubtedly tracing the intricate inscription. "It's lovely, isn't it?" Miss Marple remarked, her keen eye seeing the faint fingerlin had left behind on the glittering silver handle, a minor flaw in the elegance. Emma Fairchild approached, her smile warm but anxious. "Miss Marple, I am very delighted you arrived. Your presence always gives me a sense of calm." "That's very kind, dear," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze drawn to Emma's left hand. The young bride nervously twisted the golden band belonging to Richard's late mother. Something in her stance suggested a deeper uneasiness than just wedding nerves. A brief murmur cut short their conversation, and people turned to investigate a minor commotion near the rear garden door. Judith Fairchild stood pale and rigid, holding a crumpled note in one shaking hand. "Judith, dear, what is it?" Florence Abnethy called out nervously. "It's nothing," Judith said faintly, her voice scarcely heard above the guests' growing curiosity. Miss Marple stood, her knitting gently placed aside, and approached cautiously. She spoke softly but firmly. "Maybe some tea, Judith." Judith's gaze shifted to Miss Marple, eyes wide with barely hidden dread. "Yes, tea. Yes, of course." But Miss Marple had caught a glimpse of the note's hastily scrawled words. "It isn't too late. Inform her before it happened." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, while Judith Fairchild crumpled the note more tighter, smiling stiffly and attempted to restore calm. Something hidden simmered beneath Ivy Hill's idyllic surface, ready to shatter the carefully crafted illusion of harmony. Miss Marple had sensed it from the first tremor of a teacup, the first anxious smile, and now it was clear that disaster had arrived. Chapter 2. Following Judith Fairchild's disconcerting reaction, the tranquil day at Ivy Hill began to split into clusters of whispered conversation and worried stares. Tea continued to stream from silver pots. Cakes remained untouched, and grins became strained, but etiquette forced the visitors to retain a normal appearance. Miss Marple, crocheting in her lap, kept a close eye on the aftermath of Judith's upsetting note. She noticed Richard Hartwell's brief conversation with his father, Major Hartwell, the tightness in his stiff posture, and the clipped words he exchanged before moving directly towards his fiancée. "Emma, dear," Richard muttered softly, but Miss Marple's acute ears caught every word. "Is your mother okay? Maybe you should check on her." Emma nodded cautiously and twisted the wedding band once more. "But Richard, do you believe it isn't here?" He interrupted quietly but firmly. "We will discuss it later." Miss Marple's gaze turned subtly to Evelyn Summers, whose beautiful stance was frail. Evelyn's gaze repeatedly glanced towards Richard and Emma, her grasp tightening further on her teacup. The tension was obvious in Miss Marple's practiced look. Reverend Caldwell approached the oak tree and cautiously sat alongside Miss Marple. He spoke carefully, keeping their chat private. Judith appeared uneasy. "Miss Marple, did you see anything suspicious earlier?" Only that she seemed abnormally worried. Miss Marple responded thoughtfully, her voice low and measured. "Perhaps it's related to the note she received. Do you believe?" "This is serious," the Reverend pressed softly. "Anonymous notes rarely contain positive news." She mused softly, but it would be foolish to guess early. Emma walked gingerly across the yard towards Judith. Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the mother's quick, apprehensive glance at Major Hartwell, whose response, a delicate nod, was scarcely discernible in the crowd. Judith instantly hid her concern by smiling weakly at her daughter. "Mother, are you all right?" Emma asked quietly, resting a kind touch on Judith's arm. Yes, darling. Just feeling overloaded, I think. Judith's voice quivers slightly, revealing deeper feelings underneath her. Apparent assurances. You appeared scared, Emma insisted, lowering her voice even further. Nonsense, Rudy's said with a shaky laugh, dismissing the fear with an artificially bright smile. Are you nervous about the wedding? Nothing more. Miss Marple, observing snatches of the conversation, saw Judith's avoidance of Emma's inquisitive glance. Her hand unconsciously clenched the crumpled note buried in the folds of her dress. Meanwhile, Major Hartwell walked silently to Rose Bellamy's side, their talk quiet but heated. Miss Marple paid close attention as Rose shook her head vigorously, eyes wide with urgency, before quickly excusing herself and heading into Ivy Manor. Major Hartwell remained for a few moments, staring pensively after her, a flicker of worry crossing his normally austere features. Evelyn Summers, who had been watching the brief meeting intently, moved closer to Miss Marple, seeming to be casual. Her voice had been schooled, and it betrayed her more than she intended. Miss Marple, weddings usually seem to reveal secrets, rather than happiness, don't they? Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and maintained a neutral tone. Indeed, Miss Summers' secrets have an inconvenient way of appearing, especially on occasions where happiness should triumph. Evelyn paused, her delicate fingers twisting tightly together. I suppose some secrets should stay concealed. However, reality has its own way of appearing. Miss Marple reacted slowly and carefully, observing Evelyn's clenched jaw and slightly trembling lip. Evelyn's eyes flashed quickly with anxiety before she controlled herself and smiled strangely. Of course, you are right. She quickly went away, leaving Miss Marple to explore her unspoken anxieties. Evelyn evidently hurried Othie. As she rejoined Miss Marple, her own worry visibly heightened. Miss Marple, something is very wrong. I've known Judith Fairchild for years. She wouldn't behave like that just because she was nervous. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed quietly. She appeared to be deeply worried. Florence lowered her voice and Evelyn Summers, have you noticed how strange she has been acting? Miss Marple examined Evelyn with caution. She appears to be burdened by something substantial. Florence said, I heard she and Richard were very close before Emma entered the picture. Perhaps jealousy clouded her judgment. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Jealousy, yes, but one should use caution before jumping to conclusions. People have complex motivations for their behaviors. True, Florence confessed hesitantly, her curiosity unfulfilled. Still, it makes you question what that note was about. Miss Marple said thoughtfully, and who might have sent it. As the darkness lengthened and guests began to leave Ivy Manor, whispering escalated. Villagers exchanged cautious farewells, their prior warmth replaced by lingering skepticism and unsolved questions. Richard led Emma to the manor's front door, his arm wrapped around her waist. Evelyn, standing slightly apart, watched their departure with unmistakable bitterness. Judith Fairchild stood motionless near the garden entrance, her expression distant and troubled. Miss Marple arose slowly, gathered her knitting carefully. Reverend Cordwell extended his arm gallantly. May I take you home, Miss Marp? Thank you, Reverend, she said pleasantly, her gaze quickly drawn to a movement in an upper window of Ivy Manor. Rose Bellamy stood there, face pale, eyes wide with fright. Trouble seems rather inevitable, doesn't the Reverend remarked with mild resignation. Inevitable, perhaps, Miss Marple replied slowly, her gaze lingering on the window, but not unsolvable. As they departed Ivy Manor, Miss Marple carried a growing web of suspicions, each strand carefully related. The village's peaceful exterior had already broken, and whatever lay beneath promised revelations as disturbing as they were captivating. Chapter 3. Miss Marple awoke earlier than usual the next morning, lured by an unsettling sense of foreboding rather than the happy bird music outside her cottage window. She sipped her tea slowly, gazing intently at Ivy Manor, visible just beyond the cottage gardens, its majesty now tinged with foreboding. A harsh knock at the front door shattered her resolve. Opening it, she found Florence Onathy extremely concerned, gripping a handkerchief tightly in her hands. "Miss Marple, have you heard the terrible news?" Miss Marple observed her quietly. "Not yet, Florence." "Perhaps you should come inside." Florence raced in, her eyes fixed on Judith Fairchild. "She's dead. Found in the garden this morning. They claim she fell, an accident." But she hesitated, reducing her voice to a whisper. "It does not feel right." Miss Marple led Florence gently to a chair. "Sit down, my dear. Tell me exactly what you heard." Florence took shaky breaths to steady herself. The gardener discovered her around early, sleeping near the rose bushes. They're claiming it an accident, a fall, but Judith knew that garden better than anyone, indeed. Miss Marple agreed quietly. Judith took great delight in her rose. A slip. Appears unlikely. Florence dabbed her eyes. Exactly, Emma, poor thing. To lose her mother shortly before her wedding, it's too painful. Miss Marple nodded compassionately, her mind quickly putting together yesterday's small clues. Judith's disturbed reaction, the mysterious note, and her worried looks at Major Hartwell. Everything suddenly held new weight. "I assume the police are already involved?" she inquired gently. "Yeah, Inspector Barrow. Came 1 hour ago. He's currently speaking with Richard and Emma." Miss Marple stood firm. "Perhaps a walk to Ivy Manor will explain things." Small groupings of peasants talked uneasily, their looks disturbed yet fascinated. Inspector Barrow, a burly man known for his displeasure with town gossip, stood talking sternly to Richard Hartwell. Emma sat nearby, pale and withdrawn, with red eyes. "Miss Marple," Inspector Barrow responded quickly. "Have you come to share your insights?" Miss Marple responded gently, meeting his eyes evenly. "What an unexpected disaster," Richard whispered softly, his voice tightly controlled. "It is unthinkable. Judith was cautious. She wouldn't stumble. I can't stop thinking." Inspector Barrow interrupted. "Accidents happen, Mr. Hartwell. Let's not jump to conclusions just soon." Miss Marple interjected gently. "One could also think about recent occurrences. Judith seemed distressed yesterday. Perhaps it's related to the note she received." Emma raised her head abruptly. "What note?" Richard's eyes narrowed with concern. "Emma, your mother, got a message during tea." She appeared disturbed, but brushed it aside. "I thought she'd told you." Emma shook her head, her eyes filled with perplexity. "No, she didn't mention it. But certainly, a note couldn't be the cause." Miss Marple whispered thoughtfully. "Small things can have significant meaning." Inspector Barrow frowned impatiently. "If you have any evidence, Miss Marple. Observations, Inspector." She corrected mildly, "But I believe they may be valuable." Inspector Barrow exhaled reluctantly, conceding her argument. "Then speak freely." Miss Marple hesitated slightly before choosing her words carefully. Judith was visibly scared. Yesterday, she constantly looked to Major Hartwell, who appeared to be as unsettled. Richard's face stiffened noticeably. "My dad and Judith, surely you do not think?" Miss Marple raised her soft hand. No conclusion yet, Mr. Hartwell. Only observations. Emma's eyes expanded slightly. Richard, has your father mentioned chatting with my mother? Richard hesitated. Discomfort is noticeable. Not specifically, but something troubled him last night. He continued pacing. Distracted, he would not say what. Inspector Barrow quickly jotted something down in his notebook. I will speak with Major Hartwell shortly. Miss Marple approached Emma carefully, her voice gentle. Emma, did your mother seem worried recently? Perhaps unusually distracted? Emma paused, her gaze doubtful. She had been quiet previously, possibly due to anxiety over the wedding. But yesterday felt different, as if something was truly hurting her. Miss Marple tilted her head carefully. Did she name anyone or anything in particular? Emma's gaze glanced quickly toward Evelyn Summers, who stood at a distance, watching silently, only faintly. Something about past secrets and mistakes she had wanted to forget. She made no additional explanations. Inspector Barrow lifted his eyebrow. Secrets frequently lead to trouble. Any thoughts, Miss Marple? Not yet, Inspector, Miss Marple said, quietly, her gaze drawn to Evelyn, but I suspect the answers are somewhere in the past. Miss Marple approached Evelyn, who tensed slightly at her approach. Miss Marple replied sympathetically, What a terrible tragedy. Yes, Judith was always nice to me, Evelyn said stiffly. Miss Marple waited thoughtfully before proceeding. You appeared concerned yesterday, Evelyn. Was there anything in particular that disturbed you? Evelyn hesitated, her eyes darting frantically to Richard. Just wedding sentiments. Miss Marple. Nothing important. Miss Marple's voice became quieter, appealing honesty, but it appeared to go deeper than nerves. Evelyn's eyes flooded with tears, but her speech remained controlled. We all have secrets we would like to keep concealed. Perhaps Judith knew that better than most. Miss Marple gently nodded, taking in this carefully chosen admission. Indeed, secrets often resurface at the least convenient times. Evelyn straightened slightly and regained her confidence. Excuse me, Miss Marple. I've already talked too much. Not at all, Miss Marple said calmly. Sometimes telling the truth prevents more pain. Miss Marple left Evelyn to consider her comments, before returning thoughtfully to the manor gate. Secrets, yes, she muses. Judith's death had shattered Ivy Hill's peaceful facade, revealing dark depths beneath. Miss Marple planned to keep an eye on every tiny step as the skillful dance of concealment. And revelation continued. Chapter 4. That afternoon, Ivy Hill appeared to hold its breath, while the villagers went about their business with intentional composure. Every bakery line and churchyard path was permeated with whispered suspicion. Even the most collected minds were shaken by Judith Fairchild's unexpected and untimely demise. Ivy Manor, once a beacon of history and refinement, now exuded a sense of anxiety. Inside the manor, Emma sat at her mother's old writing desk. Her fingers lingered on a silver pen that was still uncapped. The inkwell was full. Judith had recently written something, but Miss Marple, reclining calmly nearby, observed the young woman with her customary patience. I keep thinking there's something she left behind, Emma muttered. Mother was private, but not secretive. However, she recently appeared burdened. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. She may have scribbled something down. People frequently do this when they are caught between what can and cannot be expressed out. Emma nodded and gently rose, opened the top drawer, which contained pens, cards, and sealing wax. Nothing special. She went to the second drawer, where Judith stored old letters. Emma was taken aback by the third drawer, which was painted softly blue on the interior, a detail she had previously overlooked. An envelope was found inside, beneath a folded linen handkerchief. Emma paused. There is no name on it. Miss Marple leaned forwards. May I? Emma handed it over. The envelope had been sealed and then carefully unsealed. A tiny crease down the center suggested it had been read more than once. Miss Marple unfolded the message inside. Judith's handwriting was unmistakable, despite the little number of words. If he pursues more, I will have to tell Emma the truth. I cannot let the past repeat itself. Miss Marple read the note again, folded it carefully, and returned it. Emma scrunched her brow. What does this mean? The past is likely to repeat itself. It implies something painful. Perhaps there is anything you do not yet know about your family. Someone wanted to bury her voice, which remained mild. Emma gazed down at the letter. Who did she write about? Miss Marple was silent for a minute, then spoke softly. Who had the authority to press her? Emma's gaze flickered upward. Major Hartwell. Miss Marple did not respond directly. I assume he and your mother had more than just a courteous friendship. Before Emma could react, the study door opened. Richard entered with a drawn expression. Spectre Barrow spoke to his father. He denied having an argument with Judith. They claim they have only discussed wedding details. Miss Marple tilted her head. How fascinating, especially given Judith's wish to avoid history from repeating itself. Richard blinked. What are you implying? Nothing. I am simply accumulating observations. Emma stood abruptly. Richard, have your mother and I ever met? Was there something between them? Richard's suffering was immediate. I'm not sure, but I always had the impression they weren't fond of each other. Civil, yeah, but there were silences. Miss Marple stood and approached the window. One wonders what kind of history could exist there. A decision, whether made or not, and the potential costs. Later that evening, Miss Marple stopped by the village post office, where Dora Keene greeted her with a knowing look. You've heard, of course, Dora remarked quietly, about Judith Fairchild. Yes, Dora said, bending forward. She was here only 2 days ago. I sent a letter by hand rather than posting it, and asked one of the younger lads to deliver it discreetly. I also paid him well. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled slightly. Do you recall to whom the letter was addressed? Dora hesitated and then nodded. Bellamy told Rose that it was urgent. Did she appear distressed and calm on the outside, yet her hands trembled horribly? She wore gloves, but I noticed Miss Marple thanked her before stepping back into the street. The parts were aligning, not yet creating the complete picture, but the edges were growing evident. That same evening, Miss Marple visited Rose Bellamy in her small home just beyond the vicarage. Rose opened the door warily, her face guarded. Miss Marple, may I bother you for a few minutes? This is a delicate topic. Rose hesitated before moving. Aside, the sitting room was clean, but a slight odor of recently snuffed candles clung in the air. Miss Marple relaxed onto a floral alarm chair, while Rose chose the one across from her. I suppose Judith Fairchild sent you a note 2 days ago. Rose stiffened. Who told you this? Miss Marple, the postmaster, responded softly. Nothing nefarious, simply a simple observation. May I inquire what it is about? Rose looked away. It was not about Emma. It was about something that happened years before Emma's birth. Miss Marple waited, allowing the stillness to unfold gradually. Rose gulped. Judith and I were previously friends, but there was an argument. Someone said she'd made peace with it, but I never believed her. Was Major Hartwell involved? A prolonged pause. Rose agreed, whispering. Judith never stated it outright, but she hinted. There was a night long ago when everything changed. Richard was barely older than a boy. There was bewilderment and regret. Judith always maintained her distance from him. After that, Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, and he has now married her daughter. Rose nodded, and Judith feared it would disclose everything. Was the letter a warning? Rose nodded slowly. She told me not to intervene, that Emma didn't need to know, but I believe she sensed that someone else was pressuring her. That someone would reveal the truth if she didn't act first. Miss Marple rose slowly. Thank you, Rose. You have helped more than you realize. Outside, the evening air was calm. The village, however silent, trembled with expectancy. The past had been disturbed, and someone was working very hard to keep it hidden, that the dead never remained silent for long on Ivy Hill. Chapter 5. The morning following Miss Marple's chat with Rose Bellamy arrived gloomy and windless. The type of overcast stillness that typically enveloped Ivy Hill before something broke loose. Inspector Barrow stood at his desk at the local consti, his gaze drawn to the neatly wrapped evidence bag that had just arrived. Hand-delivered by no less than a housemaid from Ivy Manor. Inside was a silver wedding spoon engraved with the initials ENR, and exhibiting a faint but distinct fingerprint, smeared at the edge but still discernible. The constable explained that it was found beneath the rose bushes, near where Judith Fairchild fell. The maid said it didn't belong there. Barrow flipped the spoon in his gloved hands, and there it was. Miss Marple was in the vicarage garden, cutting back a patch of lavender, when Reverend Codwell approached with concern. You've heard, I accept it. Miss Marple nodded. The spoon, it's generating quite a fuss. Evelyn Summers was spotted at the distillery this morning. She looked pallid as paper. Miss Marple looked down at the shears in her hand. Evelyn fidgeted with the same spoon at the wedding tea. I suspect odd, isn't it? People leave things behind because they are too distracted to notice or desperate to hide their footprints. Miss Marple's lips pinched together, not agreeing or objecting. Tell me, Reverend, do you recall anything unusual about the Fairchilds from 20 years ago? He furrowed his brow. Judith and her husband were private individuals. He died young. I believe it is heart trouble. But before then, there were whispers, a brief alienation. I believe Judith spent a season abroad in France, alone. Yes, Emma would have been an infant. Miss Marple commented. Interesting. Absences frequently hide more than presence exposes. At Ivy Manor, Emma paced the drawing incorrectly. The letter from the blue drawer was carefully folded in her palm. Richard sat near the window, watching her anxiously. We need to understand what this implies, Richard. My mother would not have written it lightly. I agree, he murmured, with uneasiness in his voice. But what good will come from dredging up past issues now? Emma turned to face him. You consider it a grievance? I believe it is risky. Look what has already happened. She's gone, Emma, and we still don't understand why. A knock interrupted them. Miss Marple entered at Emma's invitation. Her eyes were piercing, but friendly. I hear you've had visits from the consti. She spoke sweetly. Emma nodded. They discovered one of the wedding spoons among the rose bushes, the one with a fingerprint. Curious, Miss Marple responded. Did you recognize it? Richard shakes his head. They are all identical. Hundreds were ordered. Anyone could have taken one, but not everyone held it long enough to leave a fingerprint. Miss Marple spoke quietly, her attention shifting to Emma. Unless, of course, someone was attempting to rescue something dropped in a state of fear. Emma's eyes widened. Are you claiming that someone saw what happened and tried to cover it? Miss Marple responded calmly. I am saying that the presence of that spoon suggests proximity, and possibly more emotion than one would expect. Richard stood abruptly. This is lunacy. We're pursuing ghosts, not ghosts, Miss Marple explained. Simply truths that have been long buried. That's half an afternoon. Miss Marple paid Evelyn Summers a visit. Evelyn opened the door cautiously, her expression sad. I guess you're here for the spoon. Indeed, but I was hoping you could assist me. Understand Judith Fairchild's anxieties before her death. Evelyn appeared weary. I cannot tell you what you want to know, because you honestly don't know or are terrified of what it signifies. Evelyn hesitated before stepping aside to let Miss Marple in. She told me many years ago. Evelyn began cautiously, saying Emma must never learn the truth about her parentage. Miss Marple sat down carefully. Go on, there was an affair. Brief but real. It was a terrible ending for Judith and Major Hartwell. However, by the time Emma was born, Evelyn had trailed off. It was never obvious. Judith refused a paternity test and insisted that her husband's name remain on the birth certificate. Miss Marple nodded, and now Richard and Emma are engaged. Exactly, Evelyn whispered. Judith was scared that history might repeat itself. She wanted to tell Emma, but she paused too long. Miss Marple's expression remained unwavering, and you saw the note. She showed it to me. Someone threatened to reveal everything unless she stopped the wedding. Do you know who sent it? Evelyn shook her head slowly. No, she suspected. Major Hartwell. That evening, Inspector Barrow went to Miss Marple's cottage. Clearly trouble. I sent the fingerprint on the spoon for comparison, he explained. But I have a hunch we won't have to wait. Because Evelyn confessed, she inquired. No, someone attempted to break into the evidence room this afternoon. Failed. Fortunately, Miss Marple raised her eyebrow. Quite desperate. Too desperate, Barrow agreed. Whoever left that spoon understands it's the loose thread that might unravel everything. Miss Marple peered at the firelight. The question is, were they hoping to release Gil or find proof of something even worse? As night settled over Ivy Hill, the town lights came on one by one. Emma returned to her mother's old workstation in Ivy Manor's peaceful quarters. Staring at the blue drawer, she reached in, not for a letter this time, but for the mirror that Judith had hidden beneath the lining. Behind the mirror was an antique photograph with curling corners. Her mother and Major Hartwell were standing way too close for polite conversation. The past, it appeared, had never truly left. It had just been waiting for someone to notice. Chapter 6. That Sunday, the village of Ivy Hill came together for a brief memorial service in the chapel garden. Quiet, and cloaked in the propriety that sadness frequently demanded in such a setting. Judith Fairchild's untimely death had left its effect not only on her family, but on every woman who had ever poured tea beside her, and every man who had ever bowed to her politely on the path. Emma stood beside Richard, her face unflinching. Beneath a black-laced veil, Miss Marple, seated a few rows behind, noted how Emma's gloved hands clasped a folded photograph, the one of Judith and Major Hartwell, taken in another life, long before everything had begun to unravel. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to anything other than the familiar faces that morning. It was the arrival of a stranger. He waited quietly at the chapel's edge, too far away to be recognized, but close enough to see a man in his 60s, tall and slender, with a walking stick and a once expensive long brown coat. His eyes didn't flicker as Emma's voice cracked at the end of the hymn, and he didn't lower his head when the vicar gave the final benediction. Miss Marple was intently watching him. After the service, as the mourners began to disperse, the man turned to go. Miss Marple rose quickly, excused herself from Florence Anathy's commentary on the roses, and crossed the gravel path. "Excuse me," she said gently. "You weren't at the wedding tea, right?" The man paused. "No, I was not invited." There was no bitterness in his voice, only the facts. Miss Marple stepped closer. "Did you know Judith, Fairchild?" "I did, a long time ago." He observed her with quiet intelligence. "You must be Miss Marple, the woman who sees things most would rather not." She raised her head unconcerned. "And you're Malcolm Quayle?" "I was a friend of Judith's once from France." His eyebrows rose. "So she told you about it?" "She left something there," Miss Marple responded, seeing his reaction. "Or maybe someone." Malcolm looked down. "She left me behind." There was no reason to press. The stillness that ensued was as instructive as any confession. "She reached out to you recently." "The letter arrived 3 days ago," he said. "I thought it was a mistake at first, but when I read it again, I realized she meant it. She wanted to speak about Emma." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Emma," he nodded. "She wanted me to meet her only once. She didn't explain why, only that it was time. Then she died." "Yes," he said it clearly and without melodrama, but his eyes, blown grey and hollow, carried questions even he hadn't dared say out. Later that day, Miss Marple returned to Ivy Manor. The air felt colder, and the house, despite its gleaming silver and fresh flowers, seemed unfinished. She discovered Emma alone in the sitting room, with the image on her lap. "I saw him," Emma murmured quietly, before Miss Marple could respond. "The man at the memorial said, 'I don't know who he is, but I feel as if I do.'" Miss Marple sat beside her. "His name is Malcolm Quayle. He knew your mother from her time in France." Emma's hands held the photograph more securely. "He glanced at me as if he were looking for someone else in my face." Miss Marple hesitated then. "Gently, he may be your father." Emma turned away, silent for a long time. She never said anything. "Not once." Miss Marple kindly explained that she wants to protect you. She was also concerned about what others might do if they found out, especially given the timing. Emma looked up. "Do you mean Richard?" Miss Marple nodded. She couldn't bear the thought of the marriage continuing forward, if it was even possible. Emma's voice revealed that Richard and I were half-siblings. Miss Marple didn't respond. She did not need to. That evening, the constable returned to the community with the fingerprint results. Inspector Barrow met Miss Marple in the vicarage to present the results. "It was not Evelyn's," he stated plainly. "Neither Jew's nor Rose Bellamy." Miss Marple folded her hands. "So, who's Richard Hartwell?" The room went silent. Barrow added, "He claims to have touched one of the spoons some days prior. It is claimed that it landed up outside by accident." Miss Marple shook her head. "That does not explain why it was buried beneath the roses where Judith's death was discovered, or why someone attempted to break into the evidence room." Barrow agreed. They sat silently. Miss Marple ultimately admitted that Richard knew the truth or suspected. Judith must have informed him. Barrow frowned. "So, what? He killed her to prevent the wedding from being put off?" "Not quite," Miss Marple responded slowly. Richard is many things, but I do not consider him harsh. I believe he approached Judith about the letter, demanding to know the truth, and possibly it became an argument. Miss Marple commented softly that Judith had fallen or been pushed. In a moment of terror or despair, Barrow's eyes narrowed. Well, bring him in. No, Miss Marple replied firmly. Barrow lifted an eyebrow. Why not? Richard isn't the only one with something to lose, and it would be premature to charge the wrong person without knowing what Judith intended to do with the facts, who she told, and who wanted her quiet. Barrow leaned back, uneasy. You believe someone else killed her and used the spoon to frame him, Miss Marple? I believe someone was concerned about what Judith was going to say. Someone who knew what that reality would damage. Outside, the wind rattled the chapel bells in the distance. The stranger had arrived and gone. The photo had emerged. The spoon pointed to the wrong man, but Miss Marple knew where to look. Secret was not who Judith had loved, but who couldn't stand the implications of that love being revealed. Chapter 7. By mid-morning, Ivy Hill had the tight-lipped calm of a hamlet scared to guess loudly. Judith Fairchild's death was no longer regarded as an accident, though few have stated so explicitly. Those who had previously claimed certainty now exchanged looks of quiet dread. Something old had surfaced, which no one wanted to examine too closely. Miss Marple sat once more in the Fairchild drawing-room, the blue drawer open in front of her. Emma had returned to her chamber to relax, while Richard had left under the premise of going to the constipation room, but he appeared to be preparing for judgment rather than seeking justice. Miss Marple delicately moved her fingertips beneath the drawer's velvet lining. It had struck her as odd. Judith had tucked a mirror beneath it, but mirrors are rarely hidden unless they conceal something else. She lifted the velvet completely. Another ancient envelope, sealed with Judith's monogram, lay beneath it, wedged flat between the wooden base and a false panel. Miss Marple studied it carefully before opening it. Inside was a letter from approximately 30 years ago to whom it may concern. If this letter is ever read, it means I failed to keep my daughter safe from the truth I promised never to reveal. Major Hartwell and I were both young. When I discovered the pregnancy, we resolved to ignore it as a mistake. If he is reading this right now, please know that I never wanted to harm your legacy. But you cannot allow Emma to marry Richard, no matter what the cost. Major Hartwell stood in the sunroom of Ivy Manor, looking out through the tall windows into the garden where Judith had died. When Miss Marple arrived, he made no greetings, simply silence. I've come to speak openly, she explained. He did not turn. You typically. She put the letter on the table between them. Judith kept this concealed, perhaps out of shame or fear, but she wrote it in the hope that someone would stop what she could no longer do. Hartwell's shoulders, T-E-N-S-E-D. Where did you find it? In her desk, below the mirror. He eventually turned, his eyes clouded with exhaustion. Then, it's true, everything. She feared. Miss Marple said nothing. He sat heavily. The letter remained unopened next to him. I told Judith not to talk about it again because it would ruin everything. My son has built his life on a name, a heritage, and she intended to destroy that with one confession. Miss Marple explained that she did not wish to destroy him. She wanted to save Emma. Hartwell's voice crackled. I told her I'd speak with Richard. I considered stopping the wedding, but I was hesitant. I expected her to change her mind, but someone didn't hesitate. Miss Marple explained calmly. Someone else knew the truth, or enough of it to act. Hartwell looked up sharply. You don't think, I think you are guilty of silence, but not murder, he exhaled, his shoulders lowering. Who else knew, he inquired. Rose Bellamy. Evelyn Summers to a degree, but they're not the type to behave rashly, not emotionally. Miss Marple leaned forwards. Major, tell me who in this house had access to that drawer, who might have seen the letter before me. His brow wrinkled. Only Judith and maybe Emma, but she wouldn't have understood. No, Miss Marple interrupted gently. However, she may not have been alone. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the Fairchild home and requested to speak with the housemaid. Leah is a quiet 19-year-old girl with wide eyes and quivering hands. She was hesitant at first, but Miss Marple's calm attitude ultimately won her over. I was dusting in the study 3 days ago, Leah confessed. Mrs. Fairchild left the drawer open. I didn't mean to pry, but I observed her writing and then tearing something up. She wasn't aware I was there. Have you read any of it? Just a few words, names, Majors, and Emmas. It scared me. So, did you tell anyone? Leah hesitated. Mrs. Abernathy. Miss Marple blinked in surprise. Florence Abernathy, Leah nodded. She occasionally pays me to pass over small details. She usually gossips, but this time she turned pale. She told me not to mention it to anyone. Miss Marple paid Florence Onathy a visit at her house later that evening. TA was prepared, as always, but the older woman's hands shook slightly as she poured. You were always sharper than you let on, Florence replied, smiling strangely. You passed along what the maid told you, Miss Marple replied gently. But that's not all, was it? Florence's smile vanished. I tried to stop it, Jane. You must believe. It was the point. The wedding, what a shame. Can you picture what that would do to the village? To Emma? The controversy would ruin her. So, I sent the note. Miss Marple's voice softened. The one that scared Judith. Florence nodded. I believed it would be enough to get her to speak up and cancel the wedding without disclosing too much, but it drove her closer to the truth. Florence looked away. I never intended to harm her, but when I heard she had found the letter again and saw her leaning toward confession, I panicked. Miss Marple's breath caught. You confronted her in the guard. I asked her to pause and consider. She refused, claiming Emma deserved the truth. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. Have you pushed her? I grabbed her arm. She drew away, lost her footing. Florence's voice crackled. It was not murder, but it was sufficient. Miss Marple went without contacting Inspector Barrow. She stood outside, beneath the same stars that had seen Judith fall. No one had planned a killing, but secrets, once awakened, they frequently chose their own path, and some facts she knew too well demanded a price that even the well-meaning could not bear. Chapter 8. By the next morning, the summer air felt unnaturally still, as though the village itself were pausing for breath before the final turn in a story none had wanted told. Ivy Hill has learnt not to discuss things too openly, however. The absence of denial may be more damaging than the words themselves. Miss Marple sat at her parlour table with a simple meal of toast and marmalade. Her thoughts lingered not on Florence Anathy's shaky confession from the night before, but on the outstanding issues. Florence didn't mean to kill Judith Fairchild. That much was evident, but intention was only part of the truth. Someone else had tried to delete the repercussions thereafter, someone who had broken into the constapary to collect the fingerprinted spoon. Someone who dreaded what Judith's words would unleash more than Florence ever could, and who had yet to be identified. There was yet another person involved in this. By late morning, Miss Marple returned to Ivy Manor, where Emma awaited in the conservatory. Her posture was rigid, and her eyes appeared worn for someone so young. "I know there's more," Emma stated, without hesitation. "People have been murmuring around me as if I were not present. I'd like to hear it properly from you." Miss Marple regarded her face with gentle tenderness. "Your mother's death was not planned. It was a product of panic. A confrontation gone wrong." Emma blinked, but did not flinch. "Who?" "Mrs. Abernathy. She only wanted to prevent your mother from revealing a truth that she believed would ruin your future." "My parentage," Emma spoke gently. Miss Marple nodded. "But your mother had decided it was time you learned." Emma retained her. "Look, and Richard." Miss Marple halted. "You're not his sister, Emma." Emma exhaled, as if the air had been trapped in her chest for days. "Thank God," Miss Marple continued gently, but both the Major and Richard were aware of the danger. He discovered the photo and questioned Judith for the truth. If Florence hadn't come first, the confrontation might have forced her hand. Emma looked down. "Richard never said anything to me. He was trying to protect you, but he was not the one who attempted to destroy the evidence." Emma looked up sharply. "The constabulary." Miss Marple nodded. "Someone broke in to get the fingerprinted spoon. That was hidden in the garden. A panicked act, not Florence's." Emma remained quiet for a long time. "Then I recognize who it was." Evelyn slipped softly into the chair beside the fireplace. "I did not mean to lie to you." "You didn't," Miss Marple said softly. "But you left things out." Evelyn's eyes widened. "When Judith died, I suspected it was Richard. I'd seen how angry he'd become with her. I figured if the truth came out, everything would be destroyed. Therefore, you broke into the station." Miss Marple spoke. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, I figured if I could obtain the spoon, I'd ruin it. It would all remain buried. But I did not kill her. I swear it." Emma sat across from her. "Why didn't you tell me you knew about my mother and the Major?" "I was young and foolish back then. I assumed if you married Richard, you would leave Ivy Hill behind. I desired it for you. I did not want the village to turn you into another whispered tragedy." Emma stood. Her voice did not tremble. "It was not your secret to keep." Evelyn nodded again, heartbroken yet composed. "No, it was not. There could be heat." Barrow arrived soon. Afternoon. After hearing Miss Marple's whole testimony and the multiple confessions surrounding Judith's death, he massaged his brow in frustration. "No neat ending, then," he mumbled. "No," Miss Marple concurred. "But an honest one," Barrow said, shaking his head. "Florence Barney will be charged. I presume manslaughter, though she may not live long enough to stand trial." Miss Marple remarked quietly, and Evelyn, "I doubt she'll make the same mistakes again." "She's been carrying that fear a long time," Barrow sniffed. "And what of the young couple still marrying after all this?" "That," Miss Marple answered, "is a question only Emma can answer." Later that evening, Emma went to see Miss Marple alone. The garden shone in the amber light of late summer, and birds sang as if nothing awful had ever occurred here. "I don't think I'll marry Richard," Emma murmured quietly. "I adore him, but it is not the type of love that can withstand lies or history." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes love reveals itself by standing back." Emma gave a tiny smile. "My mother would have wanted me to understand the reality. I see that now. She left it for you. Hidden, indeed, but meant to be discovered. Emma gazed at the setting sky. Will the village return to normal soon? On the surface, Miss Marple stated, but something always remains. A gaze, a pause in discussion. Emma sighed. Ivy Hill is a place that remembers, even when it attempts to forget. What do you remember, Miss Marple? Miss Marple smiled and folded her hands in her lap. That secrets are never truly hidden, and that the most serious crime is not always murder, it's silent. Emma stood to depart as the sun set behind the hills, and the garden faded into a soft dusk. The truth had come at a cost, but it had arrived, and in Ivy Hill, that was more than most could have hoped for. Chapter 9. The next morning, a brisk breeze rustled the trees outside St. Luke's Church. The ivy clung fast to its stone walls, as if to protect the structure from the recent shocks in the Ivy Hill's foundation. The village, always polite, had returned to its chores and routines, but conversations were halting, glances were brief, and no one lingered long at the front gate. Inside the vicarage, Reverend Caldwell sat crouched at his writing desk, thumbing over the parish ledger with furrowed brow. He was not a man who was bothered by paperwork, but today something pulled at him. A record, a disparity, an out-of-place line. A knock shocked him. Miss Marple entered without ceremony. She immediately noticed his expression. There is something unsettling. Reverend. He looked up, little ashamed. I've been going through entries from the year Judith Fairchild returned from France. It appeared harmless until I noticed something weird. Miss Marple sat without prodding. Go on. Caldwell tapped a page. There's a record of a confidential marriage counseling session from just a month after Judith returned to Ivy Hill. But here is the odd thing. Judith came alone. Miss Marple leaned forward, not with her husband. Caldwell shook his head. No, she insisted on keeping it private, and I respected that I was new to the parish. Then she asked that nothing official be recorded beyond a placeholder note in the ledger, and the name she gave, Caldwell gave her a steady stare. She used her maiden name, Judith Merton. Miss Marple lowered her voice. She was concealing something, even from her marriage. Caldwell nodded. She never returned for a second session, but she did leave a sealed letter for me. She said it would be destroyed if nothing came of it. I kept it stashed up and forgot about it until this morning. He handed Miss Marple the letter. The paper was fragile, with thin cracks that looked like veins from the numerous folds. Judith's handwriting filled the entire page, urgent but obvious. To the one who finds this, if I failed to safeguard Emma, I must believe that the facts will do what I cannot. I sought to secure her future. I attempted to keep her innocent. That single moment of weakness. Every subsequent decision was influenced by one error. I opted to raise Emma with love rather than lies. But now I see that withholding the truth did not alleviate her suffering. It only postponed it. The truth will hurt him, and wounded pride is unpredictable, she feared. Richard, Caldwell mumbled, astonished. But he has always been reserved. Yes, but honourable. Miss Marple shakes her head. Judith wasn't frightened he would murder her. She was concerned that he would unravel. That afternoon, Miss Marple discovered Richard in the Fairchild garden, among the rose bushes where his fiancée's mother had fallen. His sleeves were rolled up, and his hands were covered in dirt. He pruned the roses with excessive precision. Miss Marple claimed she had left you a warning. Come, he did not turn. I found the photo few weeks ago. I confronted her before the fete. She denied it, of course. Said she wasn't sure, hadn't told Emma, and it didn't matter anymore. He clipped another branch, but it was important. You see, Miss Marple, I've worn the name Hartwell as a badge of honor my entire life. Father prepared me for that. Everything about my life. Miss Marple gently stated that every victory and failure had meaning because of that name. You were afraid of losing. I worried, not knowing who I was. He continued. Keep your voice low. If Emma was my sister, what exactly was I? And if she wasn't, why did I feel misled too? He turned with bloodshot eyes. I did not push her, but I did leave her there. I walked away from our argument. She was crying and terrified. I didn't care. I simply wanted it to stop. Miss Marple met his stare squarely, and when she was discovered dead, you said nothing. He nodded once, because I suspected I might have caused it regardless. You didn't, she replied. Florence Aberneth was the one who confronted her last. She grabbed her arm. Judith stumbled. Richard's lips parted slightly before closing again. So, while it was an accident, the damage occurred later. The lies, the fear that resulted from decisions made in silence. He nodded again, this time softly. Does Emma know everything? She does, Miss Marple said. And she'll decide what that truth means. Ivy Hill, rattled but standing, began a gradual retreat into dusk. Miss Marple walked home down the long way, past hedgerows and the newly formed foxglove. She hesitated at the edge of Ivy Manor's drive, gazing back once, not for the home, but for what it had held and now released. The truth had been delayed, resistive, and twisted in layers of good intentions and unfortunate timing. But now it was out, and truth, like ivy, can twist but always find its way to the surface. One chapter remained, and Miss Marple knew it would. Be the one to answer every question quietly but definitively. Chapter 10. 2 days after Richard's modest admission in the rose garden, Ivy Hill seemed to exhale. The stores resumed their normal operations, and the bell above Miss Turnley's tea shop chimed again. From the outside, the town appeared to have absorbed its latest tragedy with the same practiced grace that it had previously. But Miss Marple knew that the surface always heals first. Inside the tea establishment, they sat at a little corner table, a pot of tea between them. Emma Fairchild sat across from her. The young woman had aged in a way that had little to do with lines or grey. Her posture had improved, and her voice was more steady. He said he still wanted to marry me, Emma whispered quietly. Miss Marple nodded, listening, but it seemed hollow. Not because of the truth itself, but because we had built everything on a kind of deliberate ignorance. If we hadn't been so anxious to believe in the illusion, we would not have gotten this far. Miss Marple stirred the tea. We frequently confuse what we wish to believe for the truth, even the wisest among us. Emma offered a weak smile. You mean yourself? I've made that mistake more than once, sweetheart. But, unlike most, I notice when I do. They sipped silently for a while. Emma reached into her bag and placed a small folded paper on the table. It is from Rose Bellamy. She brought it to me yesterday, saying my mother had instructed her to deliver it only if everything came to light. Miss Marple gently unfolded the note, revealing Judith's handwriting once more. Emma, I didn't love intelligently, but I loved you completely. Whatever name you choose, bear it honestly. You were not created out of shame, but rather from a single experience that taught me everything I know about regret and resolve. Emma's hands trembled as her eyes remained dry. I often wondered if I was a burden to her. She described herself as overprotective and rigorous, but now I think she was simply terrified. I was afraid I would find out what she couldn't say out loud. Miss Marple reached across the table and delicately placed her hand on Emma's. You were never a burden, but rather a significant consequence for her. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid her farewell visit to Florence Abernathy, who was now reclining in her parlour with a wool blanket on her lap and a bittersweet demeanour. They've informed me I won't be charged formally, Florence said, her voice subdued. Inspector Barrow said it was a misadventure. Miss Marple nodded. He is not wrong, but you must live with your actions. I do, Florence replied, every moment. And yet a part of me still believes I was trying to protect Emma. You were, Miss Marple agreed. However, protection that denies the reality merely causes delay. Florence, you didn't stop anything. You only exacerbated the grief. Florence's lips twitched. Do you think she will forgive me? Miss Marple whispered softly. I think she already has, but I don't think she will ever forget. Florence stared down at her withered, worn hands. She shouldn't. Some truths are worth remembering. Miss Marple returned to Judith Fairchild's study. Later that evening, the blue drawer was now empty. The mirror was gone, and the letter had been destroyed, but a small spoon, the same one that had been buried near the rose bushes, rested in a glass case on the writing desk. Emma had chosen to display it not as a morbid sign, but as a calm reminder, a symbol of discovery rather than guilt. Inspector Barrow joined her, leaning into the doorway. You were right. Of course, Miss Marple answered modestly. I usually am. Barrow chuckled. It's funny. Most individuals believe that solving a case stops with the arrest and trial. But it never actually occurs in a place like this, does it? She agreed. In villages, the case never completely ends. It becomes part of the hedgerows and tea discourse, and it helps us learn to live together again. Barrow sighed. Will Emma be okay? She will, Miss Marple stated, because she wishes to be. She won't run away from it. She'll carry it forward. He nodded. And Richard, that is more complicated. As dusk set on Ivy Hill, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, lit the lamp, and sat by the window crocheting. The needles clicked again, steady as ever, but her mind replayed every thread of the mystery. The silver spoon, the shaky hand, the too long glance between the wrong individuals. It wasn't a story of avarice or vengeance or even cold-hearted murder. It had been a long unraveling of secrets buried behind the courteous weight of time, and it had ultimately cost a life, not by poison or bullet, but through silence, fear, and poor protection. Outside the chapel, bells echoed softly across the fields. Inside, Miss Marple closed her eyes. The lawsuit was completed. There are no clues waiting. There were no hidden truths. Only the quiet, unavoidable effects of truth setting in place. One teacup, gaze, and memory at a time. Chapter 11. Emma displayed the silver spoon the following morning. The village's beat resumed, but it was a softer rhythm, as if the ground had absorbed the echo of the confession. Ivy Hill had always been adept at returning to normalcy, but not without consequences. The air was suddenly filled with a different type of silence, one of solemnity rather than secrecy. Miss Marple received a visitor shortly after breakfast. It was Reverend Stillwater, his clerical collar slightly skewed and his eyes particularly attentive. I am hesitant to impose, Miss Marple. He proceeded to fix his sleeves, but something has been bothering me since the inquest ended. Miss Marple motioned for him to sit, with her own cup of tea still heating. Go ahead, I spoke with Rose Bellamy the day before Judith's death. He described her as very disturbed, with tears and guilt. She mentioned having seen Judith in the chapel late at night. She stated that she believed she heard someone argue. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who are you arguing with?" She wouldn't say anything other than that Judith appeared scared or angry. You understand how hard it is to tell in a location lit just by candlelight. And you think this wasn't just nerves? Miss Marple asked. The knitting paused in the middle. Reverend Stillwater shakes his head. Miss Bellamy is not the hysterical kind. It remained with me. But, Richard Florence, with everything that has happened, I have set it aside until now. Until you realized, Miss Marple said softly, that it never quite added up. He nodded solemnly. Miss Marple stepped inside the chapel 2 hours later, alone and bathed in golden morning light. The air was cold, infused with incense and thyme. She proceeded past the seats, her gaze moving down the altar rail, the stone floor, and the votive, while behind the pulpit stood the old, slightly tattered bell rope, which was hardly used any more. Her eyes shifted upward, just above the bell-shaped alcove nestled high where the stone curled inward. She spotted it, a wooden beam with a faint scuff of wax melting down, almost imperceptible. She slowly turned, her breath catching on a memory. Judith had frequented the chapel in her final days. Prayers, undoubtedly, but there was also a pattern. Always late, alone, and with Rose nearby. It wasn't grief that Judith was bearing toward the end. It was foreknowledge. She went to the tiny vestry and waited. 5 minutes later, the door opened, and Rose Bellamy entered with her cleaning basket. She froze when she saw Miss Marple. Miss Marple, I had no idea anyone was. I know you were in the chapel the night Judith died. Miss Marple spoke calmly. Rose's lips parted. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered the basket. I didn't and wasn't going to say anything. Rose whispered. It was not my place. Miss Marple responded. It is always your place when it comes to the truth, especially when the truth is the only kindness left to provide. Rose gripped the edge of the pew. I spotted Judith with somebody. They argued near the pulpit. It was Margaret. Margaret Elwood, the baker's daughter, whose family had left Ivy Hill after Emma was born. The name had almost faded when Richard suggested it. She mentioned something about a letter. Rose continued, something Judith was about to destroy, and then Judith shouted, "She will never know, I made certain." Margaret attempted to take something from her. That was when I left. And you didn't step forward because you assumed the catastrophe had already unfolded. Rose looked down, and I wondered if it was best if Emma never knew the rest. The truth was already hefty enough. It opened to reveal Margaret Elwood, older and heavier, her hair in a loose braid, her eyes sharp despite their fatigue. I was wondering when you'd come, she said. Miss Marple did not flinch. I suppose you came back to Ivy Hill the night before. Judith died. You, Margaret, stepped aside. There's no point denying it now, is there? They sat in the front parlor. There are no portraits or knickknacks, only faded wallpaper and a dense sense of unfinished history. She wrote me a letter. Margaret, said Judith, after all those years, stated she wanted to me. I visited the chapel. I did not seek money or vengeance. I just wanted her to tell Emma the truth, but she refused. She was afraid of losing her daughter, Miss Marple explained. Margaret's voice quivered. I was the daughter who was not raised, who vanished. You think I didn't want to scream that at her? But you didn't, Miss Marple said. No, I've left. I did not kill her. Miss Marple examined her attentively. I don't believe you did. But you were the last match, not the fire. Margaret did not react, but the confirmation lingered in her quiet. And Miss Marple returned to Ivy Hill's chapel late into the evening. Inside, Emma Fairchild was lighting a candle. Emma said, "I was hoping you'd come," without turning. "I've decided to keep the house for a while." Miss Marple moved closer. "There is still something you don't know." Emma's hand faltered on the match. "Judith was not only worried about losing your love." Miss Marple stated that she was terrified of the ramifications of denying someone else there. "Margaret, your birth mother, came to see her." Emma stood very still the night before her death. "She did not want you to know. She believed that sheltering you from the entire tale was her final duty." Emma's voice, when it came, was faint but certain. "Then I suppose it's time I get to know her completely." They lit the candle together. Outside, the bell tower remained silent above them, but the woman beneath the bell, Judith Fairchild, was finally understood and forgiven. Chapter 12. The next morning, the town awoke to an unexpected sound. The chapel bell, which was rarely used, rung clearly and softly. It was not an appeal for sadness or jubilation, but rather something more somber. A Miss Marple stood by her garden window, watching the fog rise from the hedgerows. The strands had been untangled, but there was still one unanswered question that had bothered her from the start. Why now? Why had Judith's secret finally collapsed from its own weight? That afternoon, she went back to Fairchild House. Emma gave her a tired smile. She led Miss Marple into the drawing room, saying, "I think you should see this. It arrived in the mail this morning. There is no comeback." On the table was an envelope containing aged cream. There's no stamp, only her name. Emma Fairchild. The inside contained a single sheet of paper and a photograph. Miss Marple picked it up. The shot looked blurry and faded. Two young women stood beside a summer fair stand, Judith and Margaret, each holding a spoon with an engraved rose. Both were smiling. The letter stated, "Dearest Emma, if this reaches you, I was not brave enough to tell you myself. I don't know what you've found, what the world has spoken in my absence. But I want to leave you with one fact not uttered in fear, but in optimism. You were born of love. That's your legacy. And, while mistakes obscured the truth, I hope that one day you will see beyond what I did and understand why I did it. Margaret was not the villain, and I was not the heroine. We were the only young women caught in the wind. Excuse me, be more daring than I was. And proudly display the rose spoon, not as a symbol of my deception, but as a reminder that stories, like silver, tarnish when hidden. Love always. Judith." Emma squeezed her lips together. I am not sure how she arranged for it to arrive later. Miss Marple gently sealed the envelope. I believe she wrote it days before her death. Most likely, someone was entrusted with sending it in case the worst happened. Emma glanced, and you meant she knew. Do you believe she was pushed? Emma inquired, her tone barely above a whisper. Miss Marple met her gaze. No, but I think she let herself fall. Emma scrunched her brow. She was cornered, Miss Marple explained. By remorse, by secrets, and the unexpected presence of Margaret, who, despite her reserve, was a mirror Judith couldn't bear to look into. I believe Judith went to the chapel knowing what could happen, but she chose silence one final time. And, my dear quiet isn't as passive as it appears. It could be a decision. Emma slipped into the recliner, her fingertips tracing the photograph's edge. The truth ends here. Miss Marple's expression relaxed. No, Emma, The truth starts here, Margaret. Elwood was standing outside, sweeping the steps of her temporary cottage. Her posture was tired, but there was no animosity in her gaze. Miss Marple approached. "I thought you might be planning to depart," she added. Margaret looked up at the sky. "I thought, but maybe it's time I stayed. Ivy Hill's as much mine as anyone's." Miss Marple nodded. "Emma knows everything." Margaret gave a short, stiff nod. "And she hasn't closed the door." Miss Marple responded. "That is something." Margaret's voice wavered. "I wasn't attempting to recover her. I just wanted to be seen," Miss Marple concluded gently. They stood in silence. Two women separated by decades, but linked by a shared sense of what it meant to lose and continue. Reverend Stillwater had consented to host a private memorial. Not formal, not big, just a place for closure. Emma arrived late, slipping into the back pew with the silver spoon fastened to her coat like a brooch. Miss Marple sat next her while the candles flickered and the priest spoke grace and the weight of hidden things. Emma leaned in and murmured, "This is strange. For the first time in days, I don't feel heavy." Miss Marple took her hand. "Since the truth one's face doesn't bury you, it releases you." And when the final song concluded and the people trickled into the darkness, Emma Fairchild stayed behind, watching the candlelight reflect in the silver of the wedding spoon, a small object with a large legacy. 1 month later, Harold Barnes and Lucy Deacon married in a small, romantic, and scandal-free ceremony. Miss Marple watched from the back row, quietly satisfied. Emma stood as maid of honor, her demeanor transformed from that of a woman wounded by a falsehood to one redefined by it. Margaret Lude, seated quietly among the visitors, met Emma's gaze briefly, and they shared a tiny, acknowledging grin. There were no words spoken, but none were necessary. Miss Marple returned to her garden, the church bells ringing far behind her. She took a moment to halt by her gate and look back. Many stories began and ended on Ivy Hill, shrouded in silver, locked in silence, whispered in chapels and beneath stairwells. But, with time, even the deepest secrets came to light, and she, ever vigilant and listening, was there to see it.